Simple Suburban Murder. Tom and Scott Mystery. Book 1. Author Mark Richard Zubro. Publisher St. Martin's Press, New York. Narrator Eric Ost. For Kathy. Chapter 1. I unlocked my classroom door and stepped inside. I stopped. Someone sat in the last desk in the last row, furthest from the door. The window blind was down, and in the early morning dimness, I couldn't tell who it was. I flipped on the lights. "Hello, good morning," I called. There was no response. With the light on, I could tell it was a male. He didn't move. Whoever it was had his head cradled in his arms on the desktop, face turned away from the door. What the hell was someone doing here? I dropped my briefcase on top of my desk, tossed my overcoat after it, and started down the aisle. Halfway to the desk, I recognized Jim Evans, the math teacher. I glanced at my watch. 6:53. Jim Evans never showed up early for school. He always walked in at 7:35 precisely, on time for work, usually the last one here. I reached him, called his name, touched his shoulder. The body was cold. He was dead. I shuddered briefly. I'd seen death before when I was a Marine in Vietnam. It never got easier to deal with, but I'd learned to accept the reality. I walked to the intercom button, pressed it. "Yes, Mr. Mason." It was Georgette Constantine, the school secretary. "Would you send Mr. Sylvester to my classroom, Georgette, and call the police?" "Mr. Sylvester is busy, Mr. Mason." She paused. "You want me to call whom?" "The police, Georgette." "Really, Mr. Mason, I can't do that. Mr. Sylvester has to make that kind of decision." "Georgette, whatever Sylvester is doing..." She interrupted. "He's with parents now, Mr. Mason. You know I'm not to disturb him when he's with parents. He always tells me parent-school relationships are the most important." I was not up to mustering the patience it normally took to deal with her. I said, "Georgette, listen, you will call the police. Tell them there's a dead person in my classroom." "What?" Her voice squeaked. "A dead body, Georgette. After you call the police, you are to go to Mr. Sylvester's office, interrupt him, and tell him what I told you." "Mr. Mason," she sounded faint. "Do it now, Georgette." I switched off the intercom. I walked back to Jim Evans. Carefully, I checked the body. There was no obvious wound. Then I raised the head. Jim Evans was no longer a handsome man. Someone had caved in the whole left side of his face. Blood caked on his head and the arms of his coat. Among the 150 or so teachers in the district, he was barely an acquaintance, not a friend. Our paths seldom crossed. Why was he dead, and why was his body in my classroom? The desk sat in neat rows, books rested in proper order on the shelves. There was no blunt instrument covered with blood and gore. I checked the top of the desk and the floor for bloodstains. A little, but not much. He'd been killed somewhere else and brought here. I heard the door open. Alfred Sylvester walked in. Compared to him, Ichabod Crane would look robust. He was in his early 60s and almost completely bald. I stood between him and the corpse. "What's the meaning of this? How dare you order my secretary around? I am not to be disturbed." I moved so he could see the corpse. I pointed to it. He shut up. "Jim Evans is dead," I said. "How can that be?" He inched closer to the body. 5 feet away, he stopped. His face turned white. "Why does this have to happen to me?" he moaned. Abruptly, he sat down in the desk closest to him. "It happened to Evans," I reminded him. He talked on as if he hadn't heard me. "There's no sub for his classes. He didn't call in saying he'd be out today. Who could I get this late? This is some sick joke." There was a commotion in the doorway. Crammed there were 4 kids from my remedial English class, who came in early each morning for help with their work. The first, Jill Anderson, took a step inside the door. "Mr. Mason!" Her voice was tentative. Her words sparked Sylvester to life. "You kids get out of here. You don't belong here now." He rushed over to them, shooing them out the door. Sporadic mumbles of, "What's going on? What is this?" broke out from them. But they moved. He slammed the door on them and turned to me. "We can't let the kids know about this. They'll never be able to handle it. And their parents. What are their parents going to say? They'll blame me. I'll have to call the superintendent." He bounced on his toes as he talked, his thin body jerking spasmodically. I walked slowly up to him and spoke softly. "We need to call his family. His wife needs to know. The kids at school will find out eventually. It's best if they're told up front, and honestly, we also need to." He snapped. "I know what you need to do. I can handle this. There's going to be trouble." The door swung open. The police walked in. I teach remedial sophomores and honors seniors English at Grover Cleveland High School in River's Edge, a far southwest suburb of Chicago. The school is over 50 years old. The roof leaks when it rains. I've been teaching since leaving the Marines. I guess I'm odd. I still love teaching after 14 years. The money's never going to make me rich, but I wouldn't trade the joy of seeing a child learn for anything. My boss, Alfred Sylvester, is a major league asshole. If there was a World Series for idiot administrators, he'd be the most valuable player. Unanimously. I watched him fawn at the police, blithering out various inanities. Early on, I perched myself on my desk out of the way. The first two cops examined the body quickly. They were young guys. From their tenderness, I guessed this was probably their first murder. Maybe even their first time with violent death. One left to get help. The other hung around looking lost. He asked me my name and if I was the one who found the body. I answered the two questions. He wandered toward the corpse, stopped halfway between it and me, and stood aimlessly. In a short while, the room began to fill with official-looking people. They talked to Sylvester, and I got him out of the room. The detectives who seemed to be in charge finally came over to me. He introduced himself. "I'm Detective John Robertson." "Tom Mason." I shook his hand. "You found the body?" "Yes." "Want to tell me about it?" I told him the story. When I finished, he asked, "Are you sure the door was locked?" "Yes, I had to use my key." "Who else has a key?" "I'm not sure. Lots of different people have used this room over the years. I doubt if they've kept accurate records. Besides, some of the keys to the other classrooms open this one too. These locks are easy to break into. Teachers forget their keys all the time. It would take a janitor half a day to get here to open it. Some of us have broken in ourselves. A few let the kids do it for them." "Terrific." He sounded disgusted. "We'll have to check everybody's keys anyway. Probably useless. The murderer might have had the sense to throw it away. Since the doors had a spring lock, it wasn't odd that I had to use the key to get in. They put in spring locks years ago because teachers kept forgetting to lock their doors, and kids got in and took unnailed down materials." Robertson gave me a suspicious look. I kept silent. He was in his early 30s, dark-haired, gray-suited, with a gray overcoat, frayed at the cuffs. He looked like his kids, job, wife, or mistress, or all four, wore him to a frazzle. "Did you kill him?" he asked abruptly. I expected the question. I returned his piercing look. "No," I said. Frank Murphy walked in. He was a police detective I knew well. We'd worked together with numerous troubled teenagers and their families for many years. Even after he was transferred to homicide, we kept in touch. Robertson explained the situation. Murphy told him we'd worked together before, that I'd been helpful to the police in dealing with troubled kids. Robertson shrugged, accepted the statement, and turned to the matter at hand. "What's the story on Evans? What was he like?" He asked me. I didn't know him well, I answered. I saw him maybe once or twice a year at teachers' meetings, but I barely knew him to talk to. I had his oldest boy as a sophomore 2 years ago. "What's his wife like?" I thought a moment. I only met her once. I remember a small, plump woman, grayish and faded, worried about the kids. She didn't know what to do about the oldest boy, Phil, the one I had at the time. She said she couldn't control him. I listened, tried to give her a few suggestions. I think mine was the only class he passed that year. She was grateful for that. Isn't it odd that a teacher's kid would be flunking? Robertson asked. I gave him a grin, smile. Not really. Teachers have the same problems with their kids that any other parents do. Sometimes I think teachers with kids who aren't making it in school are more defensive. Was Evans? I never talked to him about his kid. Why not? Like I said, the boy passed my class. He never gave me a hassle. It was the mom who had the problem at home. Anything else you know about the wife or family? Nothing about Mrs. Evans. I think there are several younger kids. One might be in 8th grade this year. If I'm not mistaken, there are 2 younger girls. How about the kid, Phil? What was Mom worried about? That was 2 years ago. It's tough to remember. As I said, I picture her as anxious, worried. Sorry, I can't be more specific. Murphy asked, what about the other kids at school? What did they think of Evans as a teacher? They complained about him a lot, but then kids complain about most teachers. But there were some who thought he was great. What was the big complaint? The usual. Too much homework. Graded too tough. He made every kid do these massive projects every year. It would count for a whole quarter grade. The slow kids could barely read the math book, much less do the projects. They also claimed he played favorites. Maybe he did. The brighter kids were the ones who tended to like him. A few said he was the best teacher they ever had. Most teachers do what we can to avoid favorites. Some kids are more likable than others. Some are jerks. You try to be fair. Some teachers are more successful at it than others. Any kids you know with grudges, active dislikes, enough to kill? I shook my head. Not that I've heard. In fact, this year the kids have said very little about him at all. How about the faculty? Any enemies there? Any major quarrels? Not that I know of. You've got to realize that with over 150 faculty members, we see very few people other than those in our own department. There was a momentary pause. Robertson shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Finally, he asked, where was you last night, Mr. Mason? I understood that. Since I found the body, I was a suspect. I spent the evening home alone. I had no visitors or phone calls. It was after 11 o'clock by the time they finished with me. I stopped in the school office to find out where my class was. In the office, Georgette fluttered nervously at the teachers' mailboxes, cramming memos into them. She gasped when she saw me. Aren't you going home? She said. I'd need a sedative if I came in and found... She gulped. Found what you did. I'd be a nervous wreck. You should sit down for a while. Do you want to lie down? There's a couch in the nurse's office. Or can I get you something? No, thank you, Georgette. Do you know where my class is meeting? No, I don't. I think Mr. Sylvester knows. She gave another little gasp. I just remembered. She clutched her throat, lowered her voice to a whisper, and said, They want to meet with you. Who does? Mr. Sylvester and the superintendent. He called earlier. I had the hardest time finding Mr. Sylvester. Long ago, I ceased being impressed with principals and superintendents. Do they want to see me now, Georgette? I'll buzz Mr. Sylvester, she spoke into the intercom on her desk, then looked up at me. They'll see you now, Mr. Mason. I walked to the door of Sylvester's office. Mr. Mason, Georgette called. I turned back to her. The police, did they... She hesitated over the words. Do they know who did it? No, Georgette. Do you think someone from school did this? I don't know. She glanced fearfully at the office door as if a gang of murderers might rush in any moment to claim her as their next victim. Row upon row of rigidly straight plaques filled the platitudes. covered one entire wall of Sylvester's office. The other walls were barren. The desk, chairs, computer, filing cabinets, and carpet were all various shades of gray. The lone window looked out on the faculty parking lot. The superintendent stood in the center of this uniformity. Jason Brompton, Armstrong, took up a major portion of what was not a small office. Blimp was a rude, but accurate word for him. He wore a black suit and a red tie. His head was bald on top with a gray fringe around the sides. His manner said salesman, with all the negative connotations attached to that word and profession. He gave me a big smile, spread his arms in friendly welcome. This made him look like a blimp, ready to land. I mistrusted the look in his eyes, his smile, and the way he stood. We exchanged greetings. Sylvester flopped officiously behind his desk. He looked fawning and alert. Armstrong subsided his bulk onto the metallic couch. I was not invited to sit. I did so anyway. The superintendent spoke. "Mr. Mason, can I call you Tom?" He didn't pause for a response. "I asked to meet with you this morning. Mr. Sylvester was kind enough to arrange it." "Arrange what?" I walked into the office. Georgette told me about a meeting. Of course, arranging meetings of such simplicity was about Sylvester's level of ability. "We want to be sure you were all right." "I'm fine, thanks." What the hell did they want? "Well, good. I wanted to be sure. You don't need a few days off." "We'd be happy to give it to you. It must have been quite a shock walking in on, well, quite a shock." "A little out of the ordinary," I admitted. He laughed uproariously. Sylvester echoed him. Armstrong chortled and slapped his knee. "You're a cool customer, Tom." "Thanks for the offer," I said, "but I'm fine." He gave me a searching look. "Well, that's good. That's great. I checked your file before I came. All top ratings. A good teacher. That's great. And I saw that you were a Marine. That's what I like. We've got to be tough, don't we? Strength is our only defense." I watched his unfriendly fat as he prattled non sequiturs. The end of class bell rang. We all looked at our watches. "Well, time's rushing," Armstrong said. "I'll get to the point. I think the thing to remember is that in unfortunate situations such as this, the most important thing is to minimize the risk of the school district being seen in a bad light in the community. We don't want them to think we aren't in control. We don't want any more bad publicity. It's bad enough as it is. All 3 TV networks were filming the district's name linked to murder on TV. Terrible. And a man dead, of course. Horribly sad. I wish I'd known him." He paused to look sad and then quickly continued. "But now the important thing is to remain dignified and serene. We have to be above all this awful mess. Don't you agree?" It sounded like pulled bullshit to me. I simply looked at him. Sylvester answered for me. "I'm sure Tom agrees that we don't want any unfortunate slips to jeopardize our position, our standing in the community." Armstrong frowned him to silence. "Tom, we would prefer if this wasn't discussed with the students or other faculty members, and when you talk to the police. If you remember that the district has been good to you for 14 years. Police can be hard-headed. We must be seen in a good light, and, of course, if reporters ask you anything, you'll refer them to us." I didn't like what he said, and I resented his nerve in saying it. Plus, the whole thing was suspicious as hell. What were these two up to? I rethought my acidic response. I gave them a neutral promise. "I'll do what I can." I wanted a chance to sort out what these two were up to. Maybe I'm too suspicious of administrators. All of them I've dealt with lie, some less than others. Few are actually outright evil, human beings. These two were putting on some kind of a show. And I wanted to know why. I tried to look sincere and benign. The tardy bell rang. It was time for the next class to begin. Briefly, Armstrong looked suspicious, but he shrugged it away. The group of seniors I tutor after school arrived on time, a rarity. The four of them, Lee Jones, Alice Delderfield, Greg Davis, and Paul Howard, clustered around my desk. "You're all a little early today," I commented. "We want to know what happened," Lee blurted out. He played right defensive tackle on the football team. The knocks to his head hadn't added anything to his performance in school. They couldn't possibly have heard either, unfortunately. Alice said, "What was it like, Mr. Mason?" Alice was a pleasantly ditzy girl. Briefly, I explained what happened. "How awful," was Alice's reaction. "Was there a lot of blood?" Lee asked. He attended every Blood and Guts Machine Gun Them All movie that came out. "Don't be gross," Alice said. He rolled his eyes, gave her a disgusted look. "Girls don't understand anything. Mr. Mason can handle this stuff. He was in the Marines in Vietnam. Besides being a teenage sexist pig, he also thinks my being in the Marines qualifies me as second to God." This I learned from his parole officer, who also suggested I never disabuse the boy of this notion, since I was the first teacher in 5 years the kid did any schoolwork for. I said, "I don't think telling all the gruesome details would be helpful. And don't be sexist, Lee." Greg broke in. "You know, the creepiest part is that it happened in school." Recently, Greg had grown a mustache. It lent him a certain rakish air. Alice had informed me that all the girls thought it made him very sexy. "This whole thing is creepy," Alice said. "Especially Mr. Evans," Lee said. "What an awful thing to say," Alice told him. "You aren't supposed to say mean things about the dead people." "I don't care," Lee said to her, then turned to me. "Mr. Mason, you said it's always better to be honest." My curiosity was up. I said, "I haven't heard you talked about him this year. What brought on these negative feelings? You didn't have him this year, did you?" "No," Lee replied. "I had him last year. I tell you, he was creepy to be around." "How so creepy?" I asked. "Well, there were always rumors about him." Lee looked at the others for one of the rare times since I'd known him. He hesitated. Alice goaded him on. "You're so brave, talking about honest. Go ahead, tell him, I dare you." I saw Gray give Lee a warning look. Lee was caught now, his nemesis, Alice, pushing him to speak, but his buddy, Greg, pulling him to silence. Paul, the quiet one in the bunch, broke the logjam. "What the heck? What's the big deal?" He shrugged his bony shoulders. It was all kids' talk. "What was?" I asked. Paul broke the circle around the desk and began hunting through the pile for his after-school work. We were in the science room. I'd stacked their work on a nearby table. He talked with his back to us. "They said he gave the bright senior girls A's if they would have sex with him." "Paul!" Alice shrieked. "Alice, please lower your decibels," I said. Paul took his materials to a desk. He looked up at us. "What's the big deal?" His voice was flat, almost bored. "There's no proof that he ever did it. I think a bunch of kids who didn't like him made it up. Kids make up all kinds of stuff." He folded his lanky frame into a desk, turned to his work, and proceeded to ignore us. Lee puffed his chest out, and throwing caution aside, said, "I know it's true. I heard once." "Hold it, Lee," I interrupted. "We don't need more rumors before you say anything. Be sure you have proof for it." "Well, I don't have proof, but everybody says." "Not everybody says, Lee. Something you saw with your own eyes." He looked sullen. "I didn't actually see him, but..." "No buts." Lee looked disgusted. "All right. But come on, Mr. Mason, you said you wanted to know stuff." A new thought struck him. "Are you going to be a detective and solve the murder? We all could help." Slow down, Lee. The police are taking care of the murder investigation. I only asked because you knew him better than I did, and you expressed some negative feelings. You mean I'm a suspect? He sounded almost hopeful. No such luck. He was crestfallen. I can't even be a suspect. You won't listen to what I have to say. His tone was more depressed than angry. Stupid proof. Then his face brightened. At least I do have proof about his kid. That Phil Evans. I thought I knew Phil pretty well, but I wanted to learn as much about the Evans family as I could, including the kids. Alice piped up. He's probably just going to tell you that Phil ran around with a bunch of kids who wrecked stuff and stole things when they were in 8th grade. Was not, Lee objected. Alice ignored him. Everybody knows it already, she sneered. I didn't, I said. What I know, nobody else knows, Lee boasted. What's that? I asked. Lee didn't look to the others for approval this time. He's a faggot. Last year I saw him and another guy in Lincoln Park in Chicago. He and this other guy were kissing. Oh, gross, Alice said. Come on, Lee, are you sure it was him? I said. I was as close to him then as I am to you now. Didn't he recognize you? Nah, he was too busy kissing. Ugh. Alice broke in. What were you doing there? Lee looked sheepish. I took a girl to the zoo. This was extremely uncharacteristic, non-macho behavior on Lee's part. He growled. I only took her there because she insisted we go. It was a cheap date. I think it's sweet, Alice said. He gave her a dirty look, then went back to his story. I saw him as we walked through the park to get to the zoo. Lee didn't sound like he made the story up. I had another thought. Did you recognize who he was with? Never saw the other guy before. He was real old like you, Mr. Mason. I don't consider 38 years old. Oh, sorry. You know what I mean. An adult. An old guy. This was last year when he was a junior, I asked. Last summer, Lee said. I looked at the others for confirmation. Greg rallied to Lee's support. I heard rumors about him too. Lots of kids think he's gay. I don't think he is. He pointed at Lee accusingly. You never told me about this. The two of them were good friends. It was summer. You weren't around and I forgot about it until now. Yeah, you forgot. You don't remember nothing half the time, Greg said. Anything, I corrected. Alice turned up her nose. I think this whole discussion is icky. I won't talk about those kind of people. The whole family is so sad. I think they should be left alone. Teenage reticence took over discussion, drifted into more mundane topics. An hour later, the kids left, and I went in search of Meg Swarthmore, her ancient and learned librarian, an ultimate clearinghouse for all school gossip. If there were secrets to be known, Meg would have them to tell. She perched in her usual spot on a tall stool behind the book return. A tiny woman, not much over 5 feet tall, and plump in a grandmotherly way. Hi, sexy, was her greeting. You're in here so rarely these days, I figured I'd better cut the bull and get to what interests me. So how about a date? I glanced around, checking for kids. She laughed when she saw me. She teased. You mean you didn't plan this visit, waiting until all the kids were gone to come in and ravish me? She twisted her kindly face into a brief pout, then a wicked grin, and finally gave a melodramatic sigh. But you're too young for me and already spoken for. I smiled contentedly. I admire you, Tom. 38 years old, settled down, living in unmarried bliss with a gorgeous blonde. My kids, and even grandkids, there's no respect these days. Keep trying to fix me up with these creaky old coots. Most of them belong in an iron lung. Or do they still have those things in this day and age? I don't know. No matter. I used to believe in true love and happiness forever. Her husband left her 35 years ago, with 3 kids to raise. He never came back. I gave her the same answer I always did. Maybe someday, Meg. I've turned down enough men to start a small country of my own, she laughed. Whoever he is, he'll have to do a hell of a lot better than the others. I smiled at her. The 3 of us will go out to dinner soon. Great. I'll look forward to it. She held my gaze for several moments. She patted my hand. You're still in love. I wish you both the best of luck. You of all the people I know deserve true love and happiness. She took a deep breath and then continued briskly. Okay, you want the lowdown on Jim Evans. You read minds now, Meg. This one wasn't hard. I barely see you for ages. You find somebody murdered in your classroom. You'd have to be a dunce not to be curious about what the hell he was doing there and who killed him. So, of course, being a normal person, you'd want to find out more. And where's the best place to find out? Me, of course. I've been expecting you. She gave a furtive look around. It's still a couple of minutes until closing, but I'd rather talk in total privacy in my office. She hopped off her chair, went to the library door, and took a quick survey of the hall. Sylvester's been lurking around lately. Near closing time, she explained. Maybe he thinks I'm stealing his precious books I've taken to bringing large, bulky purses, just to drive him nuts. I like Meg. We walked into her office and settled ourselves onto either end of a cozy little couch. Are you coping okay with what's happened? She asked. Yeah, I think I'm all right. It'll hit me more later, when there isn't as much activity. Police, kids, and Sylvester running around all day makes for a lot of hectic, Meg said. She sighed. You want to know about Evans? Let's start with the basics. Married for 20 years. 4 kids, 2 boys, 17 and 13. 2 girls, 10 and 8. Taught here. 21 years. His first job out of college. Marriage has been rocky. There was talk of divorce 5 or 6 years ago. It blew over, though. They worked out some compromises. He agreed to joint marriage counseling. She agreed to separate vacations once a year. One goes while the other stays with the kids. That sounds strange to me, but in this day and age, who knows? Another part of the agreement is that neither asks questions of the other when they get back. Unbelievable. Belief is a chancy business, I found. That's true. So, what else has our less-than-model husband been up to? He also wasn't much of a model father. A large part of the problem was abuse. His wife? Meg shook her head. The kids. That creep, I echoed my students. All of his kids? Supposedly he concentrated on the older boy, hurting him significantly at times. And nothing was done? You know how it is, Tom. He was never violent enough to put the kid in the hospital, and even then you see parents get away with it time after time. When they are caught with clear proof, getting the system to work in the kid's favor is a rarity. I never knew this when I had Phil in class. It's not something people are likely to talk about, especially kids. Besides, I presume he's stopping the abuse was part of the agreement back those 5 or 6 years. Do you know if he really did stop? As far as I've heard, yes. What about his wife? Why didn't she leave him? Facts first. She's 2 years younger than her husband. Pretty once. Now looks 10 years older than she is. No education beyond high school. Always involved with the PTA and room mothers. Why didn't she leave? Who knows? Love, lack of alternatives, fear. It could be any number of things. Would she want to kill him? You'd have to ask her that. I thought for a minute. How about the family's financial situation? Sometimes he had tons of money, threw it around all over the place. Other times, he was flat broke. Supposedly one time he tried to pawn one of his kids' baseball uniforms. What caused the swings? That I don't know. That's a hell of a way for a family to live, I commented. Real sad, Meg replied. What about at school, Meg? The kids today hinted about him trading grades for sexual favors from the senior girls. I very much doubt it. I've heard the rumor. I've never been able to confirm it. Her voice got angry, showing the tough woman underneath. But if I found out he was, the bastard would have been out on his ass and in jail, and I'd have been the one to throw him there. Her voice returned to normal. But, as I said, no confirmation on that one, and my sources are the best in the school. That doesn't mean he wasn't doing it. My sources are great, but not omniscient. How'd he get along with the faculty? For some, talking to him was like being beaten to death with an all-day sucker. I thought it was phony. To others, especially secretaries, in the math department, he was incredibly cruel. Any particular enemies in the department itself? Oh, definitely, yes. Although, I can't give you names. The department is intensely competitive. You've met Leonard Vance, the department head. I nodded. The man is brilliant, but slightly nuts. He's the only faculty member who's been here longer than me. Is that the part that makes him nuts? She smiled, brushed aside my crack with a wave of her hand. No, he's harmless enough. He's been divorced 20 years. He's been asking me out for the past 10. I always turn him down. He isn't my type. As for the department, he's got them tuned to an incredible pitch. The competitiveness comes from him. Over the years, he's gotten a lot of work out of his staff and the kids. At what cost, I'm not sure. So, the math department is not heaven on earth, I said. You can say that if you want. What's important is, I don't think you'll find your murderer there. They're an academically competitive group, but as personalities, I'd mark them in the wimp category. Then who did it, Meg? While my sources are good, catching murderers is not in their job description. How reliable is your information? It's better than gossip or rumor. Is it absolute truth? I don't know. If such a thing exists, is it factual? I think so. I do know the last time I steered somebody wrong was over 17 years ago. Are you going to volunteer this information to the police? Are you sure you were in the Marines? I never volunteer, honey. If they want to talk to an old gossip, they can come to me. I suspect they'll find out most of this information without me. I thought over what she said. One other thing, I asked. What about the older boy? Do you know anything about him? The kid said he might be gay. There, I can't help you. I keep a strictly adult grapevine. Long ago, I decided to let kids be themselves. They have their world. We adults have enough problems in our own. I rose to leave. Well, thanks, Meg. You've been a big help. Say hello to Scott for me. I will, I said and left. I realized my briefcase and overcoat were still in my classroom. The school was cold and quiet. The windows were dark. My footsteps echoed on the wooden floors in the dimly lit halls. At my classroom door, I paused over the police seal. It was nothing but a piece of ribbon loosely stretched across the doorway. I opened the door, stooped under the ribbon, and walked in. I didn't bother to turn on the lights. The soft glow from the hall was sufficient for me to make my way to the desk. I glanced to where the body had been. There were only mute desks, resting for the next day's onslaught. I picked up my things and turned toward the door. A shadow in back of the room moved. I turned toward it. "Who's there?" I said. There was a flash and a roar. The briefcase burst out of my hand. A Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.